Sid, I can think of many times when we've sat in the student presentations, the final presentations, or looked at final reports, and one of the things you said to me is they've not answered the chief executive's question. What do you mean by that?
On an MBA consulting project, you are ultimately working for a chief executive. The people, even if your visible client is, or your hidden client is quite senior, the ultimate person that will say yes or no is the chief executive. So that's the audience. Also, when you leave a business school, we hope that you'll be qualified for a chief executive's position. So you have to learn how a chief executive thinks. The chief executive's question is very simple. For anything that comes in front of you when you're a chief executive, you need to know, is this too small to matter? It shouldn't even reach me. Is this kind of big enough to be nice to have, or not very nice if we don't get it? Mm-hmm. For example, 10% change in our profits, quite nice. Mm-hmm. Is it very nice to have, very important, like it's going to double our profits or wipe them out if this thing happens? Or is it so enormous that I, as a chief executive, can't handle it? You know, I'd have to sell my business to somebody else, or I'd have to buy 3 competitors up to be able to take on this business venture.
Sure.
So that's the basis of the chief executive's question.
Have you got an example of when students have kind of missed the chief executive's question on a project?
Yeah, there was a case where, in fact, we were working for the chief executive of a company, so we thought, okay, that's the only person to please. But in that particular case, the company was actually controlled by venture capitalists, which we didn't know. So in the final presentation, the managing director came along, and also 3 different venture capitalists who were invested in the company. They clearly were the actual true chief executive. Mm-hmm. Now, what a venture capitalist wants is to get their money out in 4 years, doubled, and walk away, or to be persuaded to take a bigger bet, put twice the amount of money in, because they're going to get that doubled out in 4 years. And they're quite happy as to which they get. But that's the world they want. That's their chief executive's question. Is it big enough to matter for me? The students had come in with an evaluation of the market, the target marketplace, that said, we think there is tiny profit, £3 million a year, to be made from this market. Mm-hmm. The venture capitalist chief executive needed to get 10 or 15 million out of that. To answer his question, you didn't need a bunch of students to say, in our opinion, you'll only make 3. What he needed was an expert professional evaluation of how hard it was to get 10 or 15. That was the question he wanted answered, and then it was for him to look at the quality of evidence the students gave and decide whether he would take the risk to put more money into the business, or to exit the business, or to leave the business operating in the same way.
This topic is really quite similar to the whole thing about the hidden client, isn't it? So in this case, the hidden client is called the chief executive. And so the question that student groups is going to have is, how can we incorporate chief executive thinking into our study? How can we make sure that we're not ambushed at the final presentation by a client we didn't know about? And so the question which links to the hidden client question is any advice for students on what they can do about that?
What students need to do, firstly, is actually look at the numbers involved. How much money is at stake as a cost or a profit in the project that they're studying? Then they need to compare that with all the things the chief executive might be worrying about. So it could be simply, how big is it compared to my total profit? Or it could be, how big is it compared to what a venture capitalist needs to see coming out of my business in the next 4 years? So basically the answer is, look at the size of the numbers that are there at present, look at who else outside the business is setting big targets for it, who need to have answers about those targets, and then look at what you're finding, look at what you're proposing to the business. Because if you're too small or too big on the scale of importance, then you're not actually talking to the chief executive. A lot of student groups don't look at any numbers at all. Some look at the numbers inside their project, but don't look at the company's numbers. A great thing to do is to look at the company's numbers, look at their numbers, see whether their numbers actually are important at all to anybody in the host organization. If so, deliver that. If the numbers aren't in the right scale of importance, give them numbers in the right scale and let them decide it's too risky or needs more analysis.
And so it's important really always for the students to be thinking at the highest possible level and to have some sense of where in the company hierarchy their visible client and their hidden client and the chief executive sit.
Absolutely. That's going to be critical for all these students' future careers. We hope that a lot of them will end up as chief executives. Whatever role they have, they will need to understand the politics and the power structures above and below the chief executive. Below, down to the marketing directors and right down to the local operators, and above, right up to venture capitalists and investors and pension funds.